So, this is a new podcast, The Corruption Detective. There's been a lot of corruption in the news, in the newspapers, and they're actually part of it. So I'm going to start with something that's old, yet is very similar to things that are happening right now. The Marilyn Monroe murder cover-up. Those of you who believe that she overdosed on her own, or it was an accidental overdose, I'm very sorry to say that you're wrong. We proved that. Our agency, an investigative agency, worked on this case for approximately 4 years. There's some interesting stuff, and I can only guess there'll be a few questions, maybe a lot of questions, but either way I hope I can satisfy whatever is asked with good answers and where information can be found to corroborate and confirm what I'm telling you. So let's start off with Marilyn Monroe, the government cover-up, and the agencies involved. There's many, many reasons why Marilyn Monroe had to be murdered. The primary reason is national security. Now, all of you out there have seen movies, films, short stories of governmental agencies killing people because they're a security risk. And according to these agencies, it's in the best interest of the agency to eliminate the security risk. And so they do. Literally, one way or another. Many cases, in fact the majority of cases, it's meant to look like a suicide. Well, now there's a good example. Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, allegedly committed suicide. Do I believe he committed suicide? No. Do I have standing to say what I just said? Yes, I do. I'm a former peace officer with LA County for 7 years. After that, a special investigator, too, for the state of California. I investigated lawyers for the state bar. Thereafter, I went with the federal government. I worked for the United States courts as a federal criminal investigator. Yeah, interesting stuff. So I have about 1,000 or so stories to tell you, but right now we'll focus on one, and that's the Marilyn Monroe murder. The primary agencies involved are the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations, LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, and back in the day there was a sub-agency called the Organized Crime Intelligence Division, OCID. The OCID worked very closely with the CIA In fact, sometimes they were cross-designated and also paid by the CIA. Yeah, a bit ironic, isn't it? So, good old Marilyn Monroe. What did she do that was so wrong? She was actually a good woman, very kind-hearted. She had a kind soul. She did have a drug problem. Was it her fault? That's a yes and no. I mean, that's a subjective statement and belief. Marilyn Monroe was basically addicted to downers. Back in the day, in the 60s, 50s, they easily prescribed what's known as, and some of you may recognize the names, Red Devils. Red Devils, which is Seconal. Seconal is a barbiturate or hypnotic. And so you pop one Red Devil or one Seconal, usually it's 100 milligrams. You kind of feel like you drank 4 beers. Now that's provided you're not sleepy. If you're sleepy, you'll go to sleep. Then you have Amitol. Amitol were called Blue Angels because the capsules were blue. Amitol, like Seconal, was also a hypnotic sedative and a barbiturate. You mix the Seconal and the Amitol and you have something called Tuinol. Tuinol were called Rainbows. These are all street names. The Rainbows, Red Devils, Blue Angels. So the Tuinol was a mixture of both Seconal and Amitol. Those who wanted a good high back in the day took one of those and they were flying high, provided they didn't go to sleep. Now these are basically medium-acting drugs. And then you have long-acting drugs, barbiturates, and you also have short-acting drugs. And what I mean by that is like a short-acting drug, Nebutol, back in the day called Yellow Jackets. They basically, the onset was very quick. However, the duration of the, if you want to call it a high, was short-lived. And so Yellow Jackets, or Nebutol, was a favorite for people to take and also drink alcohol and catch a good buzz. Now again, back in the day, there was many others. Noludar, Quaaludes, and a slew of more, just so many more. So Marilyn Monroe's problem was she loved her Yellow Jackets, her Nebutol. She'd take a couple Yellow Jackets, maybe just one, sip some champagne, and catch a good buzz. Maybe have a slight slur. Now she was also taking Seconal. She was also taking Tuinol. What I reviewed during the last 3 months, I don't recall seeing Amitol. Or, actually I did see Noludar in her prescriptions. And so you know, everything I'm telling you and going to be explaining is documented in a book, The Murder of Marilyn Monroe. Her lips were sealed until now. Available on both Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Of course, the reading version, which is a whole lot less in cost. The books are great. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm one of the authors and did a lot of research. So let's get back to Marilyn Monroe. Now, this is not going to be all in one episode. I'm thinking probably about 6 episodes. Then after that, I'm going to go on to another corruption, murder cover-up by our government. Now also, some of these are not only by our government, but it could be the mob back in the day. More recently, and I know I'm going from the 50s, 60s all the way up to today, but I want to show you that there is a nexus. Again, most recently it's the same thing. Suicides. Again, I mentioned Jeffrey Epstein. And there's many more. So, my background, I told you a little bit about what I've done. I've worked 12 state death penalty cases, state of California, that I reinvestigated. It's basically getting the murder book. You start from page 1, which is a 911 call, normally, or body found, and then you read through the murder book. What I used to do was re-interview people who are still alive. I flew all over the United States to do these interviews. And also carefully scrutinized the murder book. And so the 12 cases I worked where people are on death row, one actually died of natural causes. The other 11, to my knowledge, are alive. Very few people have been executed in the state of California. And those of you who've been watching anything in the news, you know that California really doesn't execute people. That may change. They may actually eliminate the death penalty, or they may escalate it and start executing individuals in a shorter time. So with all this said, back to Marilyn Monroe. This is the focus. This is what we're talking about. I explained about the type of person she is without going into a bunch of details. Let me tell you how all this started. About 4 years ago, there was a good friend of mine. We were both on a commission for the county. He's a former, and I'm going to say a DOD, which is Department of Defense operative. Now you could use your imagination, use 3 different letters. You could pretty much put anything in there. You have the NSA, National Security Agency, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations, and there's a whole slew of more. So this individual, extremely bright man, honest to a fault, told me he was working with a production company to reinvestigate Marilyn Monroe's death, and they were going to make a movie of her last 3 days. Now this individual knew for a fact that she was murdered. Well, that raises some interest. How did he know? He knew because of the agents he worked for. It was well known, and he had kind of first-hand knowledge of what transpired. So, with that said, we discussed different things, and he asked my advice on certain things, although he really didn't need it. And it really grasped my interest. Prior to that, I didn't know a whole lot about Marilyn Monroe, other than her name, her being extremely attractive, and being an icon, and just a whole bunch of people liking her. So I decided to delve into the investigation on my own time. I did it with the co-author of the book, Tammy, and we reviewed, I want to say, thousands of hours of YouTube videos, newspaper articles, archives. We sent out numerous PRA, Public Request Act documents, and usually that's for county and state information. And then FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, is for governmental agencies, and that being the federal government. So we did send out just a whole bunch of requests. We had a lot of trouble with LAPD. They did not want to comply. And I can tell you, by the time you get to probably episode 4, maybe sooner, you'll know why LAPD did not want to comply. So, as I continued on, along with Tammy, as I mentioned, and reviewing this information, we also decided to start interviewing people that may have information. Now, we interviewed a whole bunch of people from all over the United States, both in person and over the phone. And I can tell you this, as a federal investigator, I didn't do any interviews over the phone. Everything I did was in person. I flew, unbeknownst to that person, to where I believed they were, kind of surprised them, and interviewed them on the spot. Just about every state in the United States. And also a few cases outside of the United States. They're called percipient witnesses. They usually have first-hand knowledge, and sometimes information that was never uncovered from the initial investigation. So with this said, we started compiling information. Things just did not add up. And all of those of you out there who are Marilyn Monroe fans, and if you've looked into this, you've seen yourself that there's so many different stories. How in the heck do you sort it out? Well, we meticulously did sort it out, and also everything we did, everyone we interviewed, we corroborated it first, second, sometimes third hand. That was not an easy task, but that's what we did. So we started putting together this information, and as I mentioned, it just didn't add up. We had pushback from our Public Request Act requests, pushback from our FOIA requests, and we continued on. Now, some of these requests, you'd be surprised, it took almost a year to receive the information, or sometimes 9 months for an agency to say they don't have anything that exists. But we would pursue it, and ironically, yes, the information did exist. And so we just compiled it more and more and more. So I'm going to tell you a few things just right now that will hopefully spark your interest and keep you wanting to listen to this podcast to really find out what happened to Marilyn Monroe and why. There's one very important thing that happened that was never capitalized on. Way back in the day, 1962, all the way up until today. Nobody questioned it. I find it completely bizarre, incompetent, and I must say, these agencies did a darn good job covering up what they did. So here's this little tidbit of information that's going to hopefully catch your interest. Marilyn Monroe, when she actually was picked up from her home, was approximately 5:30 in the morning, 5:30 to 6. Now this was after the police had gone there, after the doctors had called the police, and believe me, there's information about this that starts way before that was super interesting. But again, this is going to be just something to catch your interest, I hope. So Marilyn Monroe was picked up by the funeral home, not the coroner's office, the funeral home. Yes, I have documentation, I have proof, and it was just completely overlooked. So the funeral home pick her up. They take her in their funeral home car, and they take her to the mortuary. Now, they were actually getting ready to embalm her. They had Marilyn Monroe for about 3 hours, from about between 5:30 and 6 until close to 9 a.m. in the morning. When I say in the morning, this is on the Sunday, the 5th. She was actually murdered on August 4th in the evening. So Sunday morning, she's taken to the funeral home. They're getting ready to embalm her. And the coroner's office makes their call. Now the reason is because Dr. Noguchi got to the office early because he got a call about Marilyn Monroe. So he's there 7 o'clock in the morning at the coroner's office looking for her body. Nowhere to be found. So they call the funeral home. They send over 2 coroner aides. They pick her up. Then they bring her back to LA County Coroner's Office. So with that said, just that is something called a chain of custody. There was no chain of custody. So you have a body. Marilyn Monroe was dead. Is taken by 2 civilians to a funeral home for embalming, and then is picked up by law enforcement a little bit before 9 a.m. and taken back to the coroner's office. Nobody questioned this. In the real world, there's, again, the chain of command, chain of evidence. Once you breach that, you basically don't have any case to prove or disprove a whole bunch of things. And that could be even her blood tests. And the reason is because could it have been tampered with in those 3 hours? Yes. Could they have started to embalm her and then did not complete it? Yes. Did anyone find this? No. Did anyone question it? No. Did the police question it? No. Did the district attorney's office question it? No. Did the FBI? No. The CIA, where they were working in the background. And of course, LAPD, OCID, which I mentioned earlier, which is Los Angeles Police Department, Organized Crime Intelligence Division, wouldn't say anything because they were in the background completely. In fact, nobody even knew that they were involved in this way back in the day in the 60s, all the way up until the present time when our book was written. OCID was brought up one time in a few books. They called it the Gangster Squad, and they actually got the two operatives, and those are OCID police officers. They named the wrong ones because they were not the ones involved in Marilyn Monroe's murder. So there was no competent investigation done related to the Marilyn Monroe murder. With that said, again, this is the first episode, and what I just told you actually completely negates the fact that they could prove or disprove what happened to Marilyn Monroe. However, we have a whole bunch of information, and I'm going to share this with whoever's listening. Hopefully it will be a lot of people, because this is something that needs to be reopened. Unfortunately, there's very few people who could be potentially indicted, and they're so far up there in age, I don't think they're going to be around much longer. So, what I would like to tell my listeners is this is a brand new podcast, and this is just going to be the beginning of government corruption and even civilian corruption. Now, a lot of times things are called conspiracy theories. Now, conspiracy is not only a real word, but let's face it, the government will prosecute people for conspiracy. So what the naysayers add is a theory. Oh, it's just a conspiracy theory. Well, you take away theory and you have the conspiracy, and there you go. It's something they did. Not right. In fact, really wrong. But they did it. Sometimes they did it for, and I almost want to say good reasons, for the protection of our country. But, if you revert back to the Bible, thou shalt not kill, that's pretty strong. And that's one of the mortal sins in our commandments. So, with that said, I hope I caught your interest just with that one tidbit of information, and that being that Marilyn Monroe's body was not taken by law enforcement from her home to the coroner. It was missing, in essence, for 3 hours. So, listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode 1 of the podcast. And if all goes well, there's going to be, again, probably about 5 more episodes, everything to be disclosed. And you make your own decision. Don't believe what I'm saying. Corroborate what I'm saying. With that said, this is the Corruption Detective signing off, episode 1, Marilyn Monroe.